Welcome to the Sleepy Stoic. Tonight, we explore one of the most enduring ideas in ancient philosophy. It is a concept that has offered refuge to emperors and exiles alike, a fortress not made of stone but of something far more resilient. We are speaking of the inner citadel, that place within you that cannot be conquered, that sanctuary of the mind which remains yours even when everything external falls away. This idea comes to us most powerfully through Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who ruled Rome at its height and yet found his greatest strength not in legions or palaces, but in the architecture of his own thinking. Writing in his private journals, never intended for publication, Marcus returned again and again to this central truth, that there exists within each person a place of perfect safety, a refuge that no external force can penetrate without your permission. The inner citadel is not escapism. It is not denial. It is something far more practical and profound. It is the recognition that while we cannot control the storms that rage around us, we can control the fortress of our own minds. We can build walls not of avoidance but of understanding, towers not of isolation but of perspective, gates that open and close according to our own reasoned choice. Over the hours ahead, we will explore this ancient wisdom slowly, carefully, with the patience it deserves. We will examine what it means to build such a fortress, to maintain it, to live within it while still engaging fully with the world. We will consider what can truly harm you and what cannot, what lies within your power and what does not, how to distinguish between the two with increasing clarity. This is not a lesson you absorb in minutes. The inner citadel is built stone by stone, principle by principle, through patient practice and repeated return to foundational truths. Marcus himself spent decades constructing his own mental fortress, and his meditations reveal not a completed structure, but an ongoing work, a daily reinforcement of walls that time and circumstance constantly test. We begin with foundations. Before we can build upward, we must dig deep, down to the bedrock of Stoic understanding. We must first see clearly what the citadel is and what it is not, why such a refuge matters, and how the ancient Stoics conceived of the mind as something that could be fortified against fortune's arrows. The metaphor of the fortress comes naturally to philosophy. Throughout human history, we have built walls to protect what we value. Cities raised stone barriers against invaders. Castles erected keeps where defenders could retreat when outer walls fell. But the Stoics recognized something that military architects knew well. The strongest fortress is worthless if those within do not understand the principles of its defense. Your mind is such a fortress. It is the one territory that is truly yours, the one domain where you exercise complete sovereignty. But like any fortress, it requires understanding, maintenance, and the wisdom to know when to raise the drawbridge and when to lower it, when to defend and when to simply observe that certain attacks cannot reach you at all. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations while on military campaign, surrounded by the constant chaos of war, political intrigue, plague, and the immense burden of empire. Yet within those circumstances, he found and maintained his center. He did this not through escape or denial, but through the systematic application of Stoic principles, through the daily practice of returning to his inner citadel and reinforcing its walls. This is the work we undertake together tonight. We move slowly because these ideas require time to settle, to be examined from different angles, to be tried against your own experience. The Stoics believed philosophy should be practical, lived, tested daily. They were not interested in abstract speculation divorced from life. They wanted wisdom that could sustain you in the forum and on the battlefield, in loss and in success, in the quiet hours of the night when worry comes calling. The inner citadel begins with a fundamental recognition that your mind is distinct from the world around it. This seems obvious, perhaps too simple to merit attention, but the Stoics saw that most human suffering comes from forgetting this basic distinction. We blur the boundaries. We allow the external to flood the internal without inspection, without discernment, without the critical question. Does this belong here? Consider how we ordinarily live. Something happens in the world outside us. Someone speaks harshly. The weather turns foul. Plans collapse. News arrives that disturbs us. And immediately, without pause, we allow these external events to become internal states. The harsh word becomes our anger. The bad weather becomes our frustration. The collapsed plans become our anxiety. We have left the gates of our citadel wide open, and anything that approaches simply marches in and occupies our inner space. This is not how a fortress operates. A fortress has walls precisely to create a boundary, to establish a space where those within can evaluate what approaches, deciding consciously what to admit and what to turn away. The inner citadel functions the same way. It creates a space between event and response, between what happens outside and what you allow to happen within. Marcus Aurelius expressed this idea in many forms throughout his meditations. He reminded himself that things themselves do not touch the soul. They stand outside, he wrote, themselves indifferent. Disturbance comes only from our judgment about them, from the interpretation we assign, from the meaning we choose to make. The external event cannot invade your peace. Only your judgment about that event can do so, and that judgment is yours. It happens within your citadel, and you are its sovereign. This is extraordinary when you truly see it. It means that your peace of mind is not at the mercy of circumstances. It means that while you cannot control the weather, the economy, other people's opinions, or the countless external forces that sweep through life, you can control the one thing that actually creates your experience, your own faculty of judgment. But seeing this principle clearly is different from living it consistently. The work of building the inner citadel lies in the gap between understanding and embodiment. We must train ourselves, repeatedly and patiently, to pause at the boundary, to stand at the gates of our minds and question what seeks entry. The Stoics developed specific practices for this training. They called it examining impressions, a technical term for something quite simple. When something appears in your experience, you pause before reacting. You look at it carefully. You ask what it actually is, stripped of your projections and assumptions. You determine whether it belongs to things within your control or things outside it. You decide consciously what interpretation to give it, if any. This practice creates a space, a momentary distance between stimulus and response. In that space, the citadel stands. In that pause lies your freedom. Because once you react automatically, once you allow the external event to generate an internal state without your conscious involvement, you have surrendered sovereignty. You have left your citadel undefended. The philosopher Epictetus, who taught a generation before Marcus, put this starkly. He said that what disturbs people is not things themselves, but their judgments about things. When someone irritates us, we typically think the irritation comes from them, from their actions or words. But Epictetus insists the irritation comes from our judgment that we should be irritated, that this situation warrants our disturbance, that we are justified in losing our peace. This is not about suppressing feelings or pretending things do not matter. The Stoics were not advocating emotional numbness. They were identifying where your actual power lies. You cannot control whether someone speaks harshly. You can control whether you judge that harsh speech as something that should disturb your inner equilibrium. Let us be clear about what the inner citadel protects. It does not protect you from experiencing life. It does not shield you from pain, loss, or difficulty. The Stoics were remarkably unsentimental about life's hardships. They expected them, prepared for them, accepted them as part of the human condition. What the Citadel protects is something more specific and more essential: your capacity for reason, your ability to maintain perspective, your inner freedom to choose your responses. It protects your character, your integrity, your sense of who you are beneath the circumstances that come and go. Marcus Aurelius faced extraordinary pressures. The empire he inherited was beset by wars, plague, economic troubles, and political instability. He lost children, dealt with betrayal, endured physical ailments, and carried responsibilities that would crush most people. He did not build his inner citadel to avoid these realities. He built it to remain himself within them, to keep his reason functioning, to continue making sound judgments even when everything external pressed against him. This distinction matters profoundly. The inner citadel is not a retreat from reality, but a place from which to engage reality more effectively. When your peace depends entirely on external conditions, you are fragile, vulnerable to every shift in fortune. But when you have secured your inner space, when you have established that sanctuary of mind that remains yours regardless of circumstances, you become resilient in a way that no external protection can provide. Think of it this way: a fortress is not built so its inhabitants can hide forever within its walls. It is built so they have a secure base from which to operate, a place to return to, a source of strength and stability. The inner citadel functions the same way. It is your base of operations for living, the stable ground from which you meet whatever comes. The Stoics identified certain things as genuinely within your control, things that belong inside the citadel's walls. These are few but crucial: your judgments, your intentions, your desires and aversions, your use of impressions, your capacity to reason. Everything else, they said, is external. Other people's opinions, health, wealth, reputation, outcomes, circumstances, all of these stand outside the citadel. They are indifferent, neither intrinsically good nor bad, though we may reasonably prefer some to others. This division is not arbitrary. It reflects a careful analysis of what you actually control versus what you merely influence or experience. You do not control whether you get sick, but you control how you think about sickness. You do not control whether others praise or blame you, but you control whether you base your peace on their approval. You do not control outcomes, but you control whether you tie your serenity to results. When you really grasp this distinction, it changes everything. It means that the only thing that can truly harm you is your own judgment, your own consent to be harmed. External events can certainly be unpleasant, painful, difficult, but they cannot touch your inner citadel unless you open the gates and invite them in. Epictetus used a memorable phrase: "Nothing outside the will can hinder or harm the will." Your capacity for choice, for reasoned judgment, for maintaining your character, this cannot be taken from you, can only be surrendered. As long as you guard it, as long as you maintain your sovereignty over your own mind, you possess something that no tyrant can seize, no misfortune can destroy, no circumstance can strip away. This is why the Stoics spoke of inner freedom even in situations of external constraint. Marcus was emperor but often felt trapped by duty. Epictetus was once enslaved, literally owned by another person. Yet both maintained that true freedom lies not in external circumstances but in the inviolability of your own reason, your own capacity to choose your judgments. Building the inner citadel requires understanding its architecture. A fortress is not a random collection of walls. It is designed with purpose, each element serving a specific defensive function. The inner citadel has its own architecture, its own structural principles that make it resilient. The foundation is self-awareness. You cannot defend a fortress whose layout you do not know. Similarly, you cannot guard your mind if you do not notice what enters it. The first work of building the citadel is simply paying attention to your own thoughts, becoming aware of the constant stream of impressions, judgments, and reactions that flow through consciousness. Most of us live with remarkably little awareness of our own thinking. Thoughts arise and we identify with them immediately, automatically. We do not observe them, we become them. Someone criticizes us and instantly we are the defensive reaction. Something goes wrong and immediately we are the anxiety about it. There is no space, no distance, no awareness that these are processes happening in the mind rather than inevitable responses to reality. The Stoics trained themselves to observe their own minds, to stand slightly apart from the flow of thoughts and impressions, watching them arise and pass. This creates the fundamental architecture of the citadel. A watching post, a place of awareness from which you can observe what approaches and what occurs within your own consciousness. Marcus frequently reminded himself to examine his impressions, to look at his thoughts carefully before accepting them. When disturbed, he would ask himself, "What is the thing itself, stripped of interpretation? What is actually happening here outside my judgment about it?" This practice of questioning, of not accepting thoughts at face value, builds the walls of discernment. The next element is understanding the dichotomy of control, that fundamental division between what belongs to you and what does not. This principle forms the gates of your citadel. It determines what you allow to affect your peace and what you recognize as external, beyond your proper concern. This requires ongoing practice because our default tendency is to invest our peace in externals. We care deeply about outcomes, about what others think, about circumstances aligning with our preferences. There is nothing wrong with caring about these things or working toward preferred outcomes. The error lies in making our inner state dependent on them, in allowing our peace to be held hostage by things we do not control. The Stoics developed an elegant solution to this. They said we should concern ourselves with our efforts, our intentions, our actions. These are within our control, while remaining indifferent to outcomes. Do your best to promote health, but do not base your peace on staying healthy. Work toward success, but do not make your serenity depend on succeeding. Act virtuously, but do not tie your inner state to others' recognition of your virtue. This is not pessimism or fatalism. It is precision about where your power actually lies. You control your choices and efforts. You do not control results which depend on countless factors beyond you. By locating your peace in what you control rather than what you merely influence, you create an inner stability that external circumstances cannot shake. Another structural element is the practice of premeditation, what the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. This might sound morbid, but it serves a crucial defensive function. You rehearse in imagination how you will respond to difficulties before they arrive. You consider what could go wrong, what losses you might face, what challenges might come, and you practice maintaining your principles and perspective through them. This is not worrying, which is undirected anxiety about the future. This is preparation, which is purposeful rehearsal of how you will think and act if difficulties arise. A fortress runs drills, practices responses, ensures that defenders know what to do when attacked. The inner citadel requires the same preparation. The inner citadel has towers from which you survey the landscape of your life with perspective. The Stoics called this the view from above, the practice of stepping back from immediate concerns to see your situation in broader context. When caught in difficulty, we tend to see only the difficulty, to let it fill our entire field of vision. The towers of the Citadel allow you to pull back, to see this moment as one moment in a longer life, this life as one life among billions, this trouble as one variation on troubles humans have always faced. Marcus often reminded himself of this cosmic perspective. He would imagine looking down at Earth from above, seeing the bustling of humanity, the temporary nature of all concerns, the way empires rise and fall, how people worry intensely about things that will be forgotten in a generation. This was not nihilism but perspective, a way of loosening the grip of immediate concerns, of seeing them in proportion. This practice serves the Citadel by preventing any single difficulty from becoming overwhelming. When you can step back and see your trouble in context, it becomes manageable. Not unimportant, perhaps, but sized appropriately, no longer catastrophic. You can then respond to it reasonably rather than being crushed by it. The Citadel also requires provisions, stored wisdom that sustains you when under siege. The Stoics constantly reminded themselves of key principles, returning to fundamental truths again and again. This repetition was not mindless. It was practical. In moments of pressure, you need wisdom ready to hand, available immediately, not buried somewhere you cannot access it. This is why Marcus wrote his meditations as a series of reminders to himself. He was storing provisions in his citadel, keeping essential principles available for quick recall. You are a soul carrying a corpse, he reminded himself when worried about physical discomfort. Nothing can harm you but your own judgment. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. These were not empty slogans but practical tools, wisdom he could grasp quickly when needed. Building your own inner citadel requires developing your own stock of provisions, the principles and perspectives that help you maintain balance. These might be Stoic maxims or insights from other sources, reminders about what matters and what does not, perspectives that help you regain proportion when losing it. The key is keeping them accessible, practiced enough that they come naturally when stress makes thinking difficult. The Citadel also needs communication lines to the outside world. This is crucial. The inner citadel is not isolation. You do not build it to cut yourself off from life, from relationships, from engagement with the world. You build it precisely so you can engage more effectively, from a stable center rather than from reactive chaos. Think of the citadel as having well-guarded gates that you choose to open and close. You maintain boundaries while remaining connected. You preserve your inner peace while still caring about people, working toward goals, participating fully in life. The fortress is not a prison. It is a home base, a refuge you return to, a source of strength for going back out. The Stoics emphasize duty and social engagement. Marcus wrote extensively about human beings as social creatures, designed to work together, to help one another, to participate in the common good. His inner citadel did not isolate him from these responsibilities. It enabled him to meet them without being overwhelmed, to give himself to his duties without losing himself in them. This balance is subtle but essential. You build the citadel to protect your reason, your character, your capacity to choose your responses. You do not build it to escape feeling, caring, or engaging. You build it so you can do these things from a place of stability rather than from a place of reactive vulnerability. The final element of the Citadel's architecture is perhaps the most important: the recognition that it is always being built. It is never finished. Every day presents new opportunities to reinforce the walls, to practice the principles, to choose your judgments consciously rather than automatically. The Citadel is not a destination but a practice, not an achievement but an ongoing work. Marcus understood this deeply. He never wrote as someone who had mastered these principles once and for all. He wrote as someone who needed to remind himself of them daily, who struggled with the same tendencies toward disturbance that all humans face, who had to repeatedly choose perspective over reactivity, reason over emotion, principle over convenience. This should be encouraging rather than discouraging. You are not trying to reach some permanent state of unshakable calm. You are developing a practice of returning to your center, of noticing when you have left your citadel unguarded and simply returning to guard it again. Each time you pause before reacting, each time you examine an impression before accepting it, each time you remind yourself what you control and what you do not, you are reinforcing the walls. The metaphor of building is apt because it suggests patient, accumulative work. You do not erect a fortress overnight. You lay foundations carefully. You place stone on stone. You test the walls, repair weaknesses, strengthen vulnerable points. Over time, with consistent attention, the structure becomes increasingly sound, increasingly able to withstand pressure. Your inner citadel develops the same way. At first, you may notice your reactions only after they have occurred. You realize in retrospect that you surrendered your peace to something external. This is progress, this noticing. Gradually, you begin to catch yourself sooner in the midst of reaction. Eventually, you develop the capacity to pause before reacting, to stand at the gates and consciously choose what to allow in. This progression takes time. It requires patience with yourself, forgiveness when you forget the principles, willingness to begin again each time you notice you have drifted from them. The Stoics did not expect perfection. They expected practice, effort, the ongoing work of aligning your life with wisdom. Seneca, another great Stoic teacher, wrote extensively about this process of development. He noted that even the wise person is not free from passions but has learned to manage them, not immune to initial reactions but skilled at not allowing those reactions to rule. The goal is not eliminating all emotional response but cultivating the ability to choose your relationship with your responses, to observe them without being commanded by them. As we move forward through these hours together, we will explore the citadel from many angles. We will examine what threatens it and what strengthens it, how to respond to specific challenges, how to maintain your center through various circumstances. We will consider practical exercises for building the walls higher and stronger. We will look at what it means to live from this inner fortress while remaining engaged with the world. The foundations we have laid in this first hour are essential. Everything that follows builds upon these basic recognitions. That your mind is your own territory, that you can distinguish between what you control and what you do not, that external events cannot disturb your peace without your consent, that building the inner citadel is patient, ongoing work. These ideas may seem simple when stated plainly. Their power emerges in application, in the daily practice of remembering them, testing them, using them to navigate real situations. A principle is just words until you apply it. Then it becomes wisdom, lived understanding, part of your actual capacity to meet life. In the depth of his philosophical investigations, Marcus Aurelius returned again and again to a central question. What constitutes genuine security in a world defined by flux and uncertainty? The emperor understood, as only someone bearing immense responsibility could, that external fortifications provide merely the illusion of safety. Stone walls crumble, armies falter, empires themselves dissolve into memory. Yet there exists, he insisted, a fortress that stands impervious to siege, to time, to the vagaries of fortune. This fortress is the disciplined mind, the inner citadel that no external force can breach without your permission. When Marcus spoke of the inner citadel, he employed more than mere metaphor. He articulated a practical architecture of consciousness, a structure built not from stone but from principles, not from mortar but from understanding. This citadel exists in a dimension beyond the reach of circumstance. Its walls are composed of reasoned judgment. Its gates are guarded by discernment. Within its boundaries, you possess sovereignty absolute and unassailable, provided you learn to maintain its defenses. The citadel concept emerges from a profound Stoic insight that the quality of your experience depends not on external conditions but on the character of your responses to those conditions. You cannot control whether storms gather on the horizon. You cannot dictate whether others speak truth or falsehood. You cannot command the loyalty of fortune or prevent the inevitable arrival of loss and change. Yet you retain complete authority over one domain, your inner citadel, your faculty of judgment and response. This fortress is not given to you fully formed. You do not arrive in the world with walls already built and defenses already prepared. The inner citadel must be constructed deliberately, stone by stone, principle by principle, through sustained philosophical practice. Marcus himself spent decades on this construction, never considering it complete, always attending to maintenance and reinforcement. His private writings reveal not a man who had achieved perfect serenity, but one who worked daily at the craft of building and sustaining his inner refuge. The architecture of this citadel differs fundamentally from physical fortifications. A castle of stone attempts to keep the world out through barriers and exclusion. The inner citadel operates according to different principles. It does not exclude experience, but rather processes experience according to reason. It does not shut out the world, but instead establishes your relationship to the world on terms of clarity and understanding. The walls of this fortress do not separate you from reality. They protect your capacity to engage with reality from a position of philosophical strength. Consider how external fortifications function. They create safety through distance and separation, keeping threats beyond arm's reach. Yet this very separation breeds vulnerability, for you become dependent on the integrity of walls, the vigilance of sentries, the adequacy of provisions. Your security rests on factors outside your control. The inner citadel inverts this relationship. It creates safety not through distance but through understanding, not through separation but through proper relation. This fortress stands unshakable because its foundations rest on that which cannot be taken from you, your faculty of reasoned judgment. Marcus distinguished carefully between types of strength. Physical power waxes and wanes with age and circumstance. Social power depends on the consent and cooperation of others. Financial power fluctuates with fortune's turning wheel. Yet the construction of your inner citadel begins with understanding what this fortress protects. It does not shield you from discomfort, from challenge, from the natural difficulties that characterize human existence. Such protection would be neither possible nor desirable, for growth emerges through engagement with difficulty, not through its avoidance. The citadel protects something far more essential: your capacity for reasoned response, your ability to maintain philosophical perspective, your freedom to interpret events according to wisdom rather than react according to impulse. Marcus wrote that nothing can happen to you that is not a natural occurrence for a human being. This principle forms the first foundation stone of the inner citadel. When you recognize that your experiences, however challenging, fall within the normal parameters of human life, you establish a baseline of acceptance that prevents panic and catastrophizing. The fortress walls begin to rise when you cease demanding that your life be free from difficulty and instead prepare yourself to meet difficulty with philosophical resourcefulness. The second foundation stone consists of understanding the dichotomy of control with precision and depth. This is not merely the simple division between what you control and what you do not. It involves recognizing the subtle gradations of influence, the ways your power extends into some domains and evaporates in others. You control your judgments, your assent, your intentions, your efforts. These constitute the territory within your citadel walls. Everything else, outcomes, other people's actions, the turn of events, the pronouncements of fortune, exists beyond your fortress, in the realm where you may influence but cannot command. This distinction proves challenging to maintain because the human mind naturally grasps at control, seeking to extend its dominion beyond its legitimate boundaries. You want to control whether your work receives recognition. You want to control whether your relationships unfold according to your preferences. You want to control whether your careful plans produce their intended results. Yet these desires represent attempts to extend your citadel walls beyond the territory you actually possess. Such overextension weakens rather than strengthens your fortress, creating vulnerability where you sought security. The properly bounded citadel, by contrast, proves far more defensible. When you concentrate your defensive efforts on what genuinely falls within your power, judgment, and response, you create a fortress that cannot be breached. No external event, however dramatic, can force you to abandon reason if you refuse to do so. No misfortune, however severe, can compel you to interpret it catastrophically if you maintain philosophical perspective. No provocation, however inflammatory, can make you respond with rage if you preserve your self-command. This is the meaning of Marcus's frequent reminder that the mind untainted by false judgment remains invulnerable. The emperor did not suggest that philosophy makes you immune to pain or sorrow. He indicated something more subtle, that suffering, properly understood, need not corrupt your judgment or degrade your character. The inner citadel allows you to experience difficulty without allowing that difficulty to overthrow your capacity for reasoned living. Pain may arrive at the gates of your fortress, but it need not conquer the citadel itself. Building these walls requires confronting a persistent human tendency, the desire for control over what cannot be controlled. This desire operates as a kind of architectural flaw in most lives, a weakness in the foundation that permits external events to invade your inner peace. When you insist that circumstances conform to your preferences, you grant those circumstances power over your tranquility. When you demand that others behave according to your standards, you make your equanimity dependent on their choices. These dependencies create vulnerabilities, breach points where disturbance can enter your citadel. The Stoic response to this vulnerability involves a careful reconstruction of your relationship to outcomes. You learn to distinguish between your efforts and their results, between what you do and what follows from what you do. Your efforts fall within your citadel. You can choose to act with skill, attention, and virtue. You can dedicate yourself fully to worthy aims. You can bring your best capacities to bear on the challenges before you. These remain yours to command. Yet the results that emerge from your efforts, the responses others make, the ways circumstances evolve, these exist beyond your walls. They merit your interest but not your desperate attachment, your best efforts but not your inner peace. This distinction allows for passionate engagement without crippling anxiety. You can care deeply about your work while recognizing that its reception lies beyond your control. You can love thoroughly while acknowledging that you cannot dictate another's responses. You can strive mightily while accepting that outcomes depend on factors beyond your command. This is not indifference. It is proper differentiation, placing your security in what you control and relating to what you cannot control with equanimity rather than desperation. Marcus practiced this differentiation in circumstances of extraordinary pressure. As emperor, he bore responsibility for millions of lives, for military campaigns, for the stability of a vast realm. Yet his private writings reveal a man who carefully distinguished between his duty to act wisely and the outcomes he could not guarantee. He could command troops but not victory. He could issue just decrees but not their universal application. He could love his children but not protect them from illness and death. In this gap between action and outcome, he constructed his inner citadel, finding security not in controlling results but in maintaining virtuous intention regardless of results. The walls of the inner citadel rise higher when you recognize that events themselves possess no inherent emotional charge. This insight, central to Stoic thought, contradicts common experience. It seems obvious that losing something valuable causes sadness, that betrayal creates anger, that insult produces indignation. Yet these emotional responses emerge not from events themselves but from your judgments about events. Between occurrence and emotion stands interpretation, and this interpretive space constitutes the heart of your citadel. Consider how the same event produces different responses in different people. A sharp critique of your work might devastate one person, while another receives it as valuable feedback and a third dismisses it as irrelevant. The critique itself remains constant. What varies is the judgment about the critique, the meaning assigned to it, the story constructed around it. Recognition of this variability reveals where your power actually resides, not in preventing events but in governing your interpretation of events. This is not to suggest that you should feel nothing about your experiences or that emotional responses can be simply switched off through intellectual recognition. The Stoics did not advocate for emotional suppression or wooden indifference. Rather, they distinguished between emotions that arise from reasoned judgment and those that emerge from false belief. Appropriate concern for genuine harm differs from panic based on catastrophizing. Reasonable preference differs from desperate attachment. Healthy sadness at loss differs from the conviction that loss makes life unlivable. The inner citadel allows for the full range of human emotion while protecting you from emotions based on distorted judgment. When you maintain this fortress, you can grieve without descending into despair, feel disappointment without collapsing into bitterness, experience fear without surrendering to panic. The walls do not block feeling. They prevent feelings from overrunning your capacity for wise response. They create space for emotion to exist without that emotion determining your entire relationship to your experience. Building the inner citadel involves developing what the Stoics called prohairesis, that faculty of reasoned choice that stands at the center of your being. This is the citadel's keep, the innermost chamber that remains forever yours. Prohairesis encompasses your capacity for judgment, your power of assent and refusal, your ability to direct your will according to reason. It is the aspect of yourself that no external force can coerce or corrupt without your cooperation. Epictetus spoke of this faculty with particular emphasis, insisting that understanding and strengthening your prohairesis constitutes the foundation of philosophical life. When you recognize that this capacity for reasoned choice truly belongs to you, that it remains inviolable regardless of circumstance, you discover the ground on which your citadel stands. No tyrant can enter this space. No misfortune can demolish this foundation. No loss can strip you of this essential power. It persists as long as you maintain consciousness, waiting always for your employment in service of wisdom. The challenge lies not in possessing this faculty, which every rational being possesses, but in recognizing its sovereignty and learning to exercise it with skill. Most people live unaware of their prohairesis, responding to events through habit and impulse rather than conscious choice. They react rather than respond, allowing external stimuli to trigger automatic patterns. In such a state, the inner citadel stands unmanned, its defenses unused, its strength dormant and unexpressed. Awakening to your prohairesis involves developing a space between stimulus and response, that crucial interval where conscious choice becomes possible. When something provocative occurs, can you pause before reacting? When disappointment arrives, can you observe your initial impulse before surrendering to it? When temptation presents itself, can you recognize it as such before acting? This pause, this moment of conscious recognition, represents the activation of your citadel defenses. In that space, philosophy becomes practical rather than merely theoretical. Marcus trained himself to extend this pause, to create room for reasoned judgment before responding to events. His writings contain numerous instances where he reminds himself to consider whether a situation truly warrants his distress, whether the interpretation he is forming serves truth and virtue, whether his response will reflect the character he aspires to embody. These reminders functioned as defensive practices, ways of maintaining his citadel against the constant pressure of circumstance. The cultivation of prohairesis requires consistent practice. You cannot simply decide once to exercise reasoned choice and expect this decision to hold through all subsequent challenges. The habit of mindless reaction runs deep, carved by years of repetition. Overriding this habit demands patient, repeated effort. Each time you pause to consider your judgment, each time you choose response over reaction, you strengthen the walls of your inner fortress. Each time you recognize the space between event and emotion, you reinforce your defenses. This practice proves especially challenging when you feel strongly about outcomes, when stakes seem high and situations urgent. In such moments, the impulse to react overwhelms the capacity to reflect. Yet these are precisely the moments when your citadel proves most valuable. When external pressure intensifies, when emotions surge, when circumstances demand immediate response, your philosophical training becomes most necessary. The fortress you have built in calm moments provides shelter when storms arrive. Seneca emphasized this need for preparation, noting that philosophical principles learned in tranquility must be ready for application in chaos. The inner citadel is not built for display during pleasant times. Its purpose emerges when life grows difficult, when circumstances challenge your equanimity, when maintaining perspective requires genuine effort. A fortress tested only in peacetime remains untested. Your inner citadel proves its worth precisely when external conditions seem overwhelming. The maintenance of your inner citadel requires understanding what actually threatens it. This understanding proves counterintuitive because the genuine threats differ from what common opinion suggests. Most people fear external events: loss, criticism, failure, illness, death. Yet none of these can invade your citadel unless you permit them entry through false judgment. The walls of your fortress do not crumble before misfortune. They fall only when you abandon philosophical principle, when you surrender reasoned judgment in favor of distorted perception. The true threats to your inner peace are internal, not external. They include beliefs that contradict reality, attachments that make your tranquility dependent on what you cannot control, judgments that assign catastrophic meaning to neutral events, and narratives that cast you as helpless victim rather than capable agent. These represent the actual invaders, the forces that can breach your defenses if you permit them passage. No external circumstance possesses such power. Only your own misuse of judgment can dismantle your fortress from within. Consider the belief that your worth depends on others' opinions. This belief creates a vulnerability in your citadel walls, a breach through which any criticism can flood your inner sanctuary. If you accept this belief, you grant other people power over your fundamental sense of value. Their approval becomes necessary for your well-being. Their disapproval threatens your self-regard. Yet this power exists only because you granted it through accepting the underlying belief. The belief itself, not others' opinions, constitutes the threat to your peace. Similarly, the belief that life should be free from difficulty creates perpetual vulnerability. When you demand that circumstances conform to your preferences, you make peace impossible because circumstances will inevitably deviate from your preferences. You construct your citadel on unstable ground, on the expectation that reality will accommodate your wishes. When reality refuses such accommodation, as it always must, your fortress shakes. Yet the shaking originates not from external events but from the unreasonable expectation you embedded in your foundation. The well-fortified citadel rests instead on beliefs aligned with reality. You acknowledge that difficulty forms part of human experience. You recognize that you cannot control outcomes, only efforts. You accept that others possess autonomy and will not always act according to your preferences. You understand that change and loss characterize existence. These reality-based beliefs create stable foundations that remain firm regardless of what occurs. Your fortress stands secure because it does not depend on circumstances being other than they are. Marcus regularly examined his beliefs, questioning whether they served truth or merely provided comfort, whether they reflected reality or wishful thinking. This practice of belief examination constitutes essential citadel maintenance. Just as a physical fortress requires regular inspection for cracks and weaknesses, your inner citadel needs periodic review of the principles on which it stands. Do your beliefs create unnecessary vulnerability? Do your judgments align with reality? Do your interpretations serve wisdom or merely reinforce existing prejudices? This examination often reveals subtle ways you have granted external circumstances authority over your internal state. You might discover that you have made your contentment dependent on maintaining certain possessions, achieving particular outcomes, or receiving specific forms of recognition. Each such dependency represents a potential breach in your defenses, a way external events can disturb your peace. Identifying these dependencies allows you to address them, reconstructing your relationship to what lies beyond your control. The process of removing these vulnerabilities does not mean ceasing to care about anything beyond your control. You can prefer pleasant experiences to painful ones, success to failure, health to illness. These preferences fall within the category of what Stoics called preferred indifference, things that have practical value without possessing the power to make you virtuous or vicious, happy or miserable. The distinction between preferences and attachments proves crucial for maintaining your inner citadel. A preference involves inclining toward one outcome while accepting that its opposite might occur. An attachment involves making your well-being dependent on a particular outcome. You can prefer that your efforts succeed while accepting that success lies partly beyond your control. This preference does not breach your defenses. Yet if you attach your peace to success, insisting that failure would be unbearable, you create a vulnerability through which disappointment can invade your fortress. Marcus faced this distinction constantly in his role as emperor. He surely preferred military victory to defeat, prosperity to crisis, health to illness. Yet he trained himself to hold these preferences lightly, recognizing that the universe operates according to its own vast logic, that his preferences constitute merely one small voice in an infinite concert. He could work toward preferred outcomes while accepting whatever outcomes actually emerged. This acceptance did not diminish his efforts. It protected his equanimity regardless of results. This capacity to prefer without demanding, to strive without desperate attachment, emerges from understanding the nature of the universe as the Stoics conceived it. They saw existence as an interconnected whole, events unfolding according to cause and effect, each occurrence fitting into a larger pattern. Your preferences matter within this pattern, influencing outcomes through your actions. Yet the pattern itself remains far too vast and complex for any individual to control. Accepting this reality allows you to engage fully while releasing the futile attempt to dictate outcomes. Within your citadel, you maintain clarity about this relationship between effort and outcome. You give your best to what you do, bringing skill and virtue to your actions. This giving exists entirely within your power. Yet you acknowledge that your best efforts might not produce preferred results. The gap between doing well and faring well, between virtuous action and favorable outcome, this gap defines the space where philosophical maturity develops. When you can act excellently regardless of probable outcome, you demonstrate true fortress strength. The walls of your inner citadel also protect your time and attention from siege. Modern life presents countless demands, each claiming urgency, each insisting on immediate response. Without clear boundaries, these demands flood your consciousness, leaving no space for reflection, no room for philosophy, no preserve for inner life. Part of building your fortress involves deciding what deserves entry into your awareness and what can be held at the gates. This does not mean ignoring your responsibilities or retreating from engagement with the world. Rather, it involves conscious curation of what receives your attention and how much power you grant it over your state of mind. You can attend to necessary tasks without allowing them to colonize your entire consciousness. You can respond to legitimate needs without interpreting every demand as equally urgent. You can participate in the world while maintaining an inner sanctuary that remains yours alone. Marcus wrote often about returning to himself, about retreating into his inner citadel when external chaos threatened to overwhelm his clarity. This retreat did not constitute escape or avoidance. It represented a strategic withdrawal to the place where his power actually resided, to the fortress of reasoned judgment that remained always available regardless of external circumstances. In that space, he could evaluate situations clearly, consider his principles, and choose responses aligned with wisdom rather than impulse. You possess this same capacity for inner retreat. No matter how demanding your circumstances, you retain the ability to step back into the citadel of your mind, to observe your situation from the perspective of philosophy rather than panic. This stepping back might occupy only moments, brief intervals carved from chaos. Yet these moments prove sufficient for reconnecting with your center, for remembering your principles, for choosing response over mere reaction. The practice of returning to your inner citadel becomes easier with repetition. Initially, it requires conscious effort to pause, to remember your philosophical training, to create space for reasoned judgment. The momentum of habit pulls toward automatic reaction, toward allowing external events to determine internal states. Yet each time you successfully pause and return to your center, you strengthen the neural pathways that make such pausing possible. The citadel grows more accessible through use. This accessibility proves particularly valuable during extended difficulties, those sustained challenges that test endurance rather than merely demanding momentary response. When hardship persists over time, maintaining philosophical perspective requires ongoing effort. You cannot simply fortify yourself once and expect that fortification to hold indefinitely. The inner citadel needs daily attention, regular reinforcement, consistent practice of the principles on which it stands. Marcus understood this need for daily practice deeply. His writings reveal someone who returned again and again to foundational principles, reminding himself of what he knew but easily forgot under pressure. These reminders were not signs of failure but rather demonstrations of wisdom. He recognized that even a trained mind can drift from its center, that even a well-built citadel requires maintenance. His daily philosophical practice functioned as this maintenance, checking the walls for weakness, reinforcing defenses, ensuring his fortress remained strong. Your own practice might take different forms. Perhaps you begin each day by reviewing core Stoic principles, reminding yourself of what falls within your control and what lies beyond it. Perhaps you end each day by examining how you responded to challenges, whether you maintained your fortress or allowed breaches. Perhaps you carry a few key reminders throughout the day, phrases that call you back to your center when circumstances grow difficult. The specific form matters less than the consistency of practice. The inner citadel also requires defending against more subtle invaders than obvious misfortune. Comfort and success can weaken your defenses as surely as hardship can overwhelm them. When life proceeds smoothly, the temptation arises to relax your philosophical vigilance, to assume that circumstances will continue favorably, to forget that change remains the one constant. In such times, your citadel walls might slowly erode through neglect rather than crumble through assault. Seneca warned particularly against the soporific effect of prosperity, noting that ease often lulls people into philosophical laziness. When everything goes well, maintaining Stoic discipline seems unnecessary. Why practice accepting loss when you are not losing anything? Why prepare for difficulty when life feels easy? Yet this reasoning mistakes good fortune for permanent security, treating a temporary condition as an enduring state. The wise practitioner maintains citadel defenses in prosperity and adversity alike, recognizing that fortunes will continue turning regardless of its current position. The ultimate purpose of your inner citadel extends beyond personal tranquility. While protecting your peace proves valuable, the fortress serves a larger function, preserving your capacity to live according to virtue regardless of circumstances. This capacity represents your highest human potential, your ability to embody wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation no matter what occurs around you. The citadel creates conditions where this embodiment remains possible even when external conditions oppose it. Marcus recognized that his philosophical practice served not merely his own well-being, but his ability to fulfill his responsibilities with wisdom and justice. A mind disturbed by external events cannot judge clearly or act virtuously. A consciousness invaded by panic and resentment cannot respond to challenges with appropriate measure. By maintaining his inner citadel, he preserved his capacity to serve his role with philosophical excellence. His fortress protected not himself alone, but all who depended on his judgment. We have established the foundations of the inner citadel. We have explored its architecture and understood what threatens it. Now we must turn to the deeper work of maintenance and cultivation. The citadel is not built once and then left to stand on its own. It requires constant attention, not anxious vigilance, but the steady care of a gardener tending essential grounds. Marcus Aurelius understood this profoundly. His meditations are not the record of someone who achieved perfect tranquility and then simply enjoyed it. They are the daily exercises of a man who returned each morning and evening to reinforce his understanding, to shore up the walls that the day's events had tested. He did not write once about the dichotomy of control and consider the lesson learned. He returned to it again and again, examining it from different angles, applying it to different circumstances, making it more deeply his own with each iteration. This is the nature of the philosophical life. We do not acquire wisdom as we might acquire a possession, placing it on a shelf where it remains unchanged. Wisdom must be practiced, embodied, lived into again and again. The inner citadel must be inhabited actively, not merely defended passively. It is the difference between a fortress that houses a living garrison and one that has been abandoned to stand empty against the elements. What does this active inhabitation look like in practice? It begins with the recognition that our mind requires deliberate cultivation. We live in a world that constantly pulls our attention outward, that trains us to react rather than respond, that encourages us to build our sense of self on foundations of sand. The external circumstances of our lives shift continuously. The opinions of others fluctuate with their moods and interests. The body ages and changes. The possessions we accumulate can be lost or destroyed. The Stoics did not counsel us to these realities with bitterness or resignation. They pointed toward them with clarity, asking us to see what is actually stable and what is not. This seeing is itself a practice. We must return to it regularly because the habitual patterns of our thinking constantly reassert themselves. We forget what we have learned. We become caught up in the drama of external events. We begin once more to build our peace on unstable ground. So we return to the citadel. We practice the fundamental distinctions. We remind ourselves of what lies within our control and what does not. This is not mere repetition for its own sake. Each return deepens our understanding. Each application to a new situation reveals another dimension of the truth. We are not reciting a catechism but engaging in a living investigation of our own experience. Consider how often you have understood something intellectually only to find yourself acting in contradiction to that understanding when circumstances press upon you. The gap between intellectual assent and embodied wisdom is vast. Bridging it requires practice, repetition, and patience with ourselves as we learn. The inner citadel is built through thousands of small choices, daily returns to what we know to be true, gentle corrections when we find ourselves straying into old patterns of reaction and anxiety. The cultivation of the inner citadel proceeds through layers. At the surface, we practice the immediate disciplines of attention and response. We notice when our peace has been disturbed and we investigate the source. Was it truly an external event that troubled us? Or was it our judgment about that event? Did something happen to us? Or did we experience a thought or interpretation that we mistook for reality itself? These questions are not meant to invalidate our feelings or to suggest that external events do not matter. The Stoics were not teaching callous indifference to the world. They were teaching us to distinguish between the event itself and the layers of interpretation, story, and judgment that we add to it. This distinction creates space, and in that space lies our freedom. When someone speaks harshly to us, the sound waves reach our ears. This is the event. But between that physical occurrence and our emotional response lies a vast territory of interpretation. We tell ourselves a story about what their words mean, about what they reveal regarding how we are valued, about what this implies for our future interactions, about whether we are respected or dismissed. We construct an entire narrative in seconds, and it is usually this narrative, not the words themselves, that disturbs our peace. The practice of inhabiting the inner citadel means becoming aware of this process as it happens. Not after the fact, when we have already been swept into reactivity, but in the moment when interpretation begins to layer itself onto perception. This awareness is cultivated slowly. At first, we notice our reactivity only after it has fully flowered into emotion and behavior. With practice, we begin to catch it earlier, seeing the interpretive process as it unfolds. Eventually, a gap opens between stimulus and response, and in that gap we find our freedom to choose how we will relate to what has occurred. This is not about suppressing emotion or forcing ourselves to remain calm. It is about developing the capacity to observe our own mental processes with some degree of distance. When we can see our thoughts as thoughts rather than as direct perceptions of reality, we regain our agency. We are no longer at the mercy of every external fluctuation. We have found our center, and from that center we can respond with wisdom rather than merely reacting from habit or fear. The Stoic texts are filled with exercises designed to cultivate this capacity. Seneca recommends the evening review, a practice of examining the day's events not with harsh judgment but with honest inquiry. What disturbed your peace today? What provoked anger or anxiety? Can you trace the disturbance back to its source? Was it the event itself or your interpretation of it? What might you do differently tomorrow when a similar situation arises? This evening review is not an exercise in self-criticism. It is an act of philosophical attention, a way of learning from our experience rather than simply being buffeted by it. When we review the day with curiosity rather than judgment, we begin to see patterns. We notice that certain types of situations consistently disturb us. We observe the particular interpretations we habitually apply. We recognize the stories we tell ourselves about what events mean. This recognition is itself transformative. When we can see our patterns clearly, they lose some of their automatic power over us. We begin to recognize them as they arise. A familiar situation occurs, and we feel the old interpretation beginning to form, but now there is awareness present. We catch ourselves in the act of storytelling, and that awareness creates choice. Marcus Aurelius practiced a morning meditation as well, preparing himself for the day ahead. He reminded himself that he would encounter difficult people, that unexpected challenges would arise, that circumstances would not always align with his preferences. But he also reminded himself that none of these external events could touch his inner freedom unless he consented to be disturbed by them. He was not steeling himself against the day with grim determination. He was simply recalling what he knew to be true and setting the intention to remember it when tested. These practices of morning preparation and evening review create a rhythm of philosophical attention. We are not trying to maintain constant vigilance, which would be exhausting and ultimately counterproductive. We are establishing regular times to return to the Citadel, to check the walls, to remember what we are protecting and why. These bookends to the day create continuity. The morning practice sets our intention. The evening practice helps us learn from what has occurred. Over time, this rhythm becomes natural, and the insights from these dedicated times of reflection begin to influence our responses throughout the day. Between morning and evening, we practice presence. This is perhaps the most challenging and the most essential work. The mind habitually drifts either into the past or the future. We replay conversations, regretting what we said or imagining what we should have said. We project into tomorrow, next week, next year, constructing elaborate scenarios of what might happen and how we will feel about it. In all this mental time travel, we miss the only moment in which we actually live. The inner citadel exists only in the present moment, cannot be found in memories or projections. When we are lost in rumination about the past or worry about the future, we have abandoned the citadel. We have left the only ground that is actually solid beneath our feet and wandered into the territory of imagination and interpretation. Returning to the present moment is the fundamental practice of inhabiting the inner citadel. This does not mean we never reflect on the past or plan for the future. Both have their proper place. We learn from experience, and we prepare wisely for what lies ahead. But there is a difference between useful reflection and rumination, between prudent planning and anxious worry. The difference lies in whether we remain grounded in the present moment even as we think about other times. When we reflect on the past from a grounded present, we can extract its lessons without being trapped in regret or resentment. When we plan for the future from the stability of now, we can prepare wisely without becoming lost in anxiety about what might happen. The present moment is not a narrow slice of time that excludes all consideration of past and future. It is the stance from which we relate to all of time with wisdom and clarity. Epictetus taught his students to pay attention to their impressions, to the initial appearances that arise in consciousness before judgment solidifies around them. This practice of observing impressions is essentially a practice of presence. When something happens, there is a moment before we have fully decided what it means, before our interpretation has hardened into conviction. In that moment lies tremendous freedom. Imagine receiving news that initially appears negative. Perhaps a project you worked on has been criticized, or a plan you made has fallen through, or someone you care about has expressed disappointment in you. The immediate impression registers. You feel a contraction, an unpleasant sensation in the body, perhaps. This is the raw experience before interpretation fully takes hold. The untrained mind moves instantly from impression to judgment, from judgment to emotion, from emotion to reaction. The process happens so quickly it seems like a single event. But it is not. There are distinct stages, and between each stage there is a gap where awareness can enter. The practice is to gradually expand our awareness so that we can observe more of this process as it unfolds. At first, we might notice our reactions only after we have already spoken or acted. We see in retrospect that we responded with defensiveness or anxiety. With practice, we begin to catch the emotion before it produces behavior. We feel the anger or fear arising, and we have a moment to choose whether to act from it. With further practice, we can observe the judgments forming before they produce emotion. We see ourselves beginning to interpret the event in a particular way, and we can question whether that interpretation is accurate or helpful. Eventually, with sustained practice, we can sometimes observe the raw impression itself before judgment begins to form around it. This is not a constant state of awareness, but it becomes possible more often. And in those moments, we experience a profound freedom. We see that the event itself is neutral until we decide what it means. This neutrality of events is one of the core insights of Stoic philosophy, and it is easily misunderstood. The Stoics are not claiming that all events are equally desirable or that we should have no preferences. They are pointing out that events in themselves, prior to our interpretation, do not contain the quality of good or bad. That quality is added by our judgment. Health is generally preferable to illness. This is reasonable and natural. But when illness comes, as it inevitably will at some point, the illness itself does not make us miserable. Our thoughts about the illness, our resistance to it, our fear of what it might mean, our frustration that it has disrupted our plans, these thoughts and judgments create suffering on top of the physical discomfort. The physical symptoms are what they are. They may be uncomfortable or painful, but they are simply sensations. The mental anguish we add through our judgments and interpretations is something else entirely. And this mental anguish is where we have agency. We cannot always control what happens to our bodies, but we can influence how we relate to what happens. This is not about positive thinking or pretending that difficult situations are actually wonderful. It is about recognizing the difference between the situation itself and the layer upon layer of judgment and story we add to it. When we can see this distinction clearly, we suffer less. Not because we have become callous or indifferent, but because we have stopped adding unnecessary suffering to the inevitable difficulties of life. The cultivation of this clarity is the work of inhabiting the inner citadel. We practice noticing when we are lost in interpretation rather than present with what actually is. We practice returning to the simple facts of the situation without the dramatic narratives we tend to construct. We practice asking ourselves what is actually happening right now, in this moment, stripped of all our fears about what it might mean for the future or our regrets about how it differs from what we wanted. Often, when we return to this simple presence, we find that the actual situation is more manageable than the stories we were telling ourselves about it. The stories multiply our suffering. They project current difficulties into an imagined future where everything has gone wrong. They interpret a single setback as evidence of comprehensive failure. They take one person's criticism as proof that everyone sees us as inadequate. When we can disentangle ourselves from these stories and return to what is actually present, we often find that the ground beneath our feet is more solid than we thought. Yes, this particular thing has happened. Yes, it is uncomfortable or disappointing or painful. But right now, in this moment, we are still here. We still have our capacity to respond with wisdom. The inner citadel still stands. This return to presence, this disentangling from unnecessary story and judgment, must be practiced with great gentleness. We are working against powerful habits of mind that have been forming throughout our lives. We are not going to suddenly become perfectly equanimous, able to meet all situations with immediate calm and clarity. The path of the inner citadel is gradual, and it requires patience with ourselves as we learn. When we notice that we have been caught in reactivity, lost in stories, disturbed by events we cannot control, the appropriate response is not harsh self-criticism. That would simply be another way of abandoning the citadel, another way of making our peace dependent on external conditions, even if those conditions are our own behavior. The appropriate response is gentle acknowledgement and return. We notice, we recognize, we return. This simple pattern, repeated thousands of times over months and years, gradually rewires our relationship to experience. We become more familiar with the citadel than with the reactive patterns that pull us away from it. The center becomes more accessible. The capacity to return develops into a kind of reflex, not automatic in the sense of unconscious, but natural in the sense of well-practiced. Marcus Aurelius reminds himself repeatedly in his private writings to be tolerant of error, both in himself and in others. He recognizes that people act from their current understanding, which is always limited and often mistaken. This includes his own understanding. He is Emperor of Rome, supposedly the most powerful man in the world, yet he maintains a posture of humility regarding his own wisdom and virtue. He knows he will make mistakes. He knows he will sometimes lose his center and react rather than respond. The practice is not to achieve perfection, but to continue returning, to keep learning, to remain committed to the path even when we stumble on it. This humility is essential to the maintenance of the inner citadel. Perfectionism is actually a subtle form of dependence on external conditions. If we can only be at peace when we are performing flawlessly, when we never make mistakes or lose our composure, then our peace depends on achieving a standard that is probably unrealistic and certainly unsustainable. We have made our tranquility conditional on our perfect behavior, which is simply another way of being tossed about by circumstances. True equanimity includes the ability to be at peace even with our own imperfection. This does not mean complacency or lack of effort to improve. It means recognizing that our essential worth, our inner freedom, does not depend on achieving some ideal state. The citadel is available to us right now, with all our flaws and failures and ongoing struggles. It is not a prize we earn through perfect practice, but a reality we can inhabit even in our imperfection. As we continue to develop the inner citadel through practice, we begin to notice subtle shifts in how we experience our lives. These shifts are not dramatic transformations. We do not suddenly become unaffected by difficulty or immune to disappointment. But something in our relationship to these experiences changes. There is more space around them. They do not define us as completely as they once did. We might still feel frustrated when plans fall through, but there is an awareness present that can hold the frustration without being consumed by it. We notice the frustration rather than being identical with it. This creates a kind of freedom even within the emotion. We are not trying to suppress or deny what we feel, but we are also not completely at its mercy. This capacity to hold our experience with some spaciousness is one of the fruits of the practice. It develops gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. We might not notice the change until we look back and recognize that we responded to a recent difficulty with more equanimity than we would have in the past. Or someone points out that we seem less rattled by setbacks than we used to be. These are signs that the foundation is becoming more solid, that the walls of the citadel are being reinforced through practice. The work continues. There is no point at which we can declare the citadel complete and cease our practice. Life continues to test us. New challenges arise that we have not encountered before. Old reactive patterns we thought we had moved beyond suddenly reappear under particular circumstances. The Stoic path is not about reaching some final state of perfect wisdom, but about maintaining a practice, a way of engaging with our experience that keeps us connected to our deepest values and our inner freedom. Marcus Aurelius, after decades of philosophical practice and years of living deliberately according to Stoic principles, still needed to write himself reminders in his private notebooks. He still needed to redirect his attention when it wandered into worry or complaint. He still needed to practice seeing events according to their true nature rather than according to his immediate impressions. This is not evidence that the practice does not work. It is evidence that the practice is always ongoing, always relevant, always necessary. The inner citadel is not a static structure we build once and then inhabit effortlessly thereafter. It is a living reality that we create and recreate through our attention and our practice. Each moment offers us the choice to remember what we know or to forget it, to respond from our center or to react from old patterns, to remain within the citadel or to wander into territory where our peace depends on circumstances we cannot control. The practice is to keep choosing, to keep returning, to keep cultivating the ground of our inner freedom with patience, gentleness, and unwavering commitment to what we know to be most deeply true. We have spent considerable time exploring the architecture of the inner citadel, understanding its foundations, examining its walls, and contemplating the nature of the sanctuary it protects. Now we turn toward the practical work of construction and maintenance. Theory without application remains merely an interesting set of ideas. The citadel must be built through deliberate practice, stone by stone, habit by habit, choice by choice. The question before us is not whether the inner citadel is a beautiful concept. The question is how we actually build it in the midst of our daily lives, how we strengthen it when challenges arrive, and how we maintain it across the changing seasons of our existence. Marcus Aurelius did not write his meditations as a public philosophy text. He wrote them as private reminders to himself, practical instructions for maintaining his own inner fortress while managing the enormous responsibilities and pressures of ruling an empire. His writings reveal a man actively working on his citadel each day, not someone who had perfected it once and could then forget about it. This tells us something important about the nature of this work. The citadel is not built once and then left to stand on its own. It requires daily attention, regular inspection, continuous reinforcement. The practices that build mental resilience are not one-time achievements but ongoing commitments. Let us begin with the morning, because how we begin the day significantly influences what happens within our citadel throughout the hours that follow. The Stoics placed great emphasis on morning preparation, on mentally arming ourselves before we encounter the challenges that await. Marcus Aurelius advised himself each morning to remember that he would encounter difficult people during the day, people who were meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. But he reminded himself that these people behaved this way out of ignorance of what is good and what is bad. This was not pessimism but practical preparation. The morning practice involves a form of mental rehearsal. Before you leave the sanctuary of your home, before you encounter the day's demands, you prepare the citadel. You remind yourself of what is within your control and what is not. You recall your principles. You strengthen your resolve. This might take the form of quiet reflection while you drink your morning coffee or tea. It might occur during a walk before the day's work begins. It might happen in the stillness before others in your household awaken. The specific form matters less than the consistency and intentionality of the practice. During this morning preparation, you are not trying to predict every specific challenge you will face. That would be impossible and would generate anxiety rather than readiness. Instead, you are reminding yourself of the general truth that challenges will come, that people will sometimes act in ways that could disturb your peace if you permit it, that circumstances will not always align with your preferences. You are also reaffirming your commitment to your principles. You recall what truly matters to you, what kind of person you are working to become, what values guide your choices. This is like checking that the gates of your citadel are properly secured, that your philosophical arms are ready, that your mental disciplines are accessible. Another essential morning practice involves reviewing the dichotomy of control. You explicitly acknowledge what is within your power today and what is not. Your efforts, your intentions, your character, your responses are within your control. Outcomes, other people's behavior, external events, and circumstances are not. This daily renewal of the distinction between what is yours and what is not yours creates clarity that protects you throughout the day. When something disturbing happens, you have already prepared yourself to ask the essential question: is this within my control or not? The answer guides your response and protects your citadel from unnecessary invasion. As the day progresses, the practice shifts from preparation to active maintenance. Throughout your daily activities, you have opportunities to strengthen the citadel through small choices and responses. Each decision to align with your principles adds another stone to the wall. Each choice to respond with virtue rather than react with emotion reinforces the structure. Consider the practice of the brief pause before responding to any situation that triggers a strong emotional reaction. Someone says something that angers you. Your immediate impulse is to respond sharply, to defend yourself, to counterattack. But you have been practicing maintaining your citadel. You insert a brief pause between the external event and your response. In that pause, you return to your inner sanctuary. You ask yourself what the situation actually threatens. Does it threaten your body? Perhaps. Does it threaten your reputation? Possibly. Does it threaten your inner citadel, your essential character and virtue? No. Nothing can threaten that without your consent. This pause need not be long. A few breaths, a moment of silence, a brief internal question. What would wisdom counsel here? The pause creates space for your governing faculty to operate rather than being swept away by initial emotional reactions. Epictetus taught his students to practice this pause constantly. When faced with any impression, any appearance, any initial reaction, he advised them to say, You are an appearance and not at all the thing you appear to be. Then examine it by the principles you have, especially by asking whether it concerns things within your control or things not within your control. This examination becomes faster and more natural with practice. At first, it may feel artificial, like you are forcing yourself to think in a way that does not come naturally. Over time, it becomes more automatic. Your mind learns to pause, to question, to evaluate before responding. This is your citadel becoming stronger, its defenses becoming more reliable. Throughout the day, you also practice what the Stoics called prosoke or attention. This is the practice of maintaining awareness of your inner state, of noticing when you are beginning to lose your center, of catching yourself when you start to give assent to impressions that would disturb your peace. Prosoke is like having a watchman on the walls of your citadel, constantly alert, always observing, ready to sound the alarm when something approaches that requires your attention. This watchfulness is not anxious or paranoid. It is calm, steady awareness. You notice when your thoughts begin to spiral into worry about the future. The watchman alerts you. This is a mental invasion, not based on present reality but on imagination of what might happen. You gently redirect your attention to what is actually before you now, to what you can actually do in this moment. You notice when you begin to rehearse grievances from the past, when you start mentally arguing with someone who wronged you yesterday or last year. The watchman alerts you. This is allowing the past to invade the present, giving power to events that no longer exist except in your memory. You acknowledge the thought and let it pass, returning to your center. This practice of attention throughout the day prevents many disturbances from gaining entrance to your citadel. You catch them early, before they establish themselves, before they multiply and spread. This is far easier than trying to evict them once they have made themselves at home in your thoughts. The afternoon often brings its own particular challenges. Fatigue begins to set in. Your patience wears thin. Your philosophical resolve, so strong in the morning, may start to weaken. This is when the citadel requires deliberate reinforcement. Consider building a practice of brief afternoon renewal. This might be a short walk, a few minutes of quiet reflection, a moment to step away from your tasks and remember your larger purposes. You are not escaping from life but returning to your center so you can engage with life more effectively. During this afternoon check-in, you might review how the day has gone so far. Have you maintained your principles? When you have fallen short, you note it without harsh self-judgment. You are a work in progress, and the citadel is strengthened through honest acknowledgement of both successes and failures. If you have handled a difficult situation well, you take note of this, not with pride that could become arrogance, but with recognition that your practice is bearing fruit. The citadel is working. Your preparations are effective. This recognition encourages continued practice. If you have responded poorly to something, you examine it. What happened? What triggered the response? What could you do differently next time? This examination is not about guilt or self-recrimination, but about learning, about strengthening weak points in your defenses. The evening brings another important practice, the Stoic review of the day. Seneca wrote about examining his entire day each evening, reviewing his actions and responses as if he were both prosecutor and judge of himself. This was not meant to produce guilt, but to create learning and growth. You might practice this while preparing for bed, during evening reflection time, or in whatever quiet moment the evening affords. You review the day's events, particularly those moments when you were tested, when your citadel faced challenges. What did you do well? Where did you maintain your center? When did you respond according to your principles? These successes deserve recognition. They show that your practice is effective, that the Citadel is becoming stronger. You acknowledge this progress. Where did you fall short? When did you allow something external to disturb your peace? When did you react rather than respond? When did you forget your principles? These are not failures but opportunities for learning. They show you where the walls need reinforcement. The key to the evening review is honesty without harshness. You are not berating yourself for imperfection. You are honestly assessing your progress, identifying patterns, noticing where your practice needs attention. Marcus Aurelius was constantly noting his own shortcomings in his private writings, not from self-loathing but from commitment to improvement. As you review each incident, you consider what you might do differently in the future, not with anxiety or determination to be perfect, but with calm intention to continue growing. The next time a similar situation arises, you will remember this evening's reflection. The Citadel learns from experience. Beyond these daily practices, there are longer-term exercises for building and maintaining the inner citadel. One of the most powerful is the practice of voluntary discomfort, what the Stoics called practicing poverty or hardship training. This does not mean deliberately making yourself miserable. It means periodically choosing to experience minor discomforts voluntarily so that you become less dependent on comfort, less afraid of discomfort, more confident in your ability to endure. Seneca described setting aside certain days to practice poverty, eating simple food, wearing plain clothes, sleeping on a hard surface. The purpose was not to despise wealth or comfort, but to prove to himself that he could be content without them, that his peace did not depend on external conditions. You might practice this by occasionally choosing the harder option when an easier one is available, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, walking instead of driving when both are options, eating a simple meal instead of an elaborate one, sitting with minor physical discomfort instead of immediately adjusting. These small practices build mental resilience. They prove to you that you are stronger than you might think, that you can endure more than you habitually allow yourself to experience. They reduce your fear of discomfort, which is often more limiting than the discomfort itself. The practice of voluntary discomfort also prepares you for involuntary discomfort. When genuine hardship arrives, and it will, you have already experienced something like it voluntarily. The shock is less severe. You know you can endure because you have already done so by choice. Another powerful practice is negative visualization, or premeditatio malorum, which we explored earlier. This becomes not just a concept but a regular exercise. You periodically imagine losing what you value, not to make yourself anxious but to appreciate what you have and prepare yourself for the reality of impermanence. You might practice this weekly or monthly, setting aside time to imagine various challenges or losses. What if you lost your job? What if a relationship ended? What if your health declined? What if you lost your home? You do not dwell morbidly on these possibilities, but you calmly consider them. The purpose is twofold. First, this practice helps you appreciate what you currently have. When you imagine losing something, you recognize its value and feel genuine gratitude for its presence in your life now. Second, you mentally prepare yourself for possible futures. If these events occur, they will not completely blindside you. Your citadel has already considered such possibilities. During negative visualization, you also imagine how you would respond to these challenges according to Stoic principles. How would you maintain your virtue in that circumstance? What would be within your control? How would you find meaning and purpose even in that difficult situation? This mental rehearsal strengthens your confidence that you could handle such events if they arrived. Another essential practice is what we might call principle rehearsal. You regularly review and contemplate the fundamental principles that guide your life. Not just reading them, but deeply considering what they mean and how they apply to your circumstances. You might select a particular Stoic teaching or philosophical principle and spend time reflecting on it. What does it really mean? How does it apply to your current situations? Where have you seen it proven true in your experience? How could you apply it more fully? This contemplative practice deepens your understanding and strengthens your commitment to your principles. They become not just ideas you agree with, but convictions that guide your actual choices. They become part of the architecture of your citadel, fundamental structures that support everything else. Reading Stoic texts regularly serves a similar purpose. Not as academic study, but as practical philosophy, as reminders and reinforcements of what you already know but easily forget in daily life. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself of basic Stoic principles because he knew that without regular renewal, even deeply held convictions can fade. You might establish a practice of reading a brief passage of Stoic philosophy each morning or evening, not to acquire new information but to remind yourself of timeless wisdom. These readings shore up the walls of your citadel, strengthen your resolve, and reconnect you with a long tradition of people working toward the same aims. The practice of service to others also builds the inner citadel, though this might seem counterintuitive. How does focusing on others strengthen your own inner fortress? Because virtue is strengthened through exercise, and helping others provides opportunities to practice wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. When you act according to your principles in service of others, you prove to yourself that your values are real, not just theoretical. You demonstrate that your citadel is not an ivory tower of self-protection, but a source of strength that enables you to engage constructively with the world. Furthermore, recognizing that you are part of a larger human community, that you have responsibilities beyond yourself, paradoxically strengthens your inner independence. You become less focused on whether external events serve your narrow interests and more concerned with whether your responses serve the common good. This does not mean sacrificing your inner citadel to others' demands. It means that a strong citadel enables generous engagement with life rather than fearful withdrawal from it. The sanctuary within allows you to venture forth with confidence, knowing you have a secure foundation to return to. Physical practices also contribute to mental resilience. The Stoics recognized that we are embodied beings, that the mind and body are not separate entities but aspects of a unified whole. Taking care of your physical health supports the strength of your inner citadel. Regular exercise, adequate sleep, reasonable nutrition, these are not separate from philosophical practice but support it. A body weakened by neglect makes it harder to maintain mental clarity and emotional balance. You need not become an athlete, but you benefit from treating your body with respect and care. These practical applications of the inner citadel concept all share common features. They are regular practices, not one-time events. They require intention and attention, not just passive hoping. They build on each other, creating cumulative strength over time. They connect ancient wisdom with contemporary life. Most importantly, these practices work with human nature rather than against it. They acknowledge that maintaining mental resilience requires ongoing effort, that the citadel is not a static achievement but a living practice. They transform philosophy from interesting ideas into practical skills. As you engage with these practices, remember that imperfection is expected and acceptable. You will forget. You will fall short. You will have days when the citadel seems weak and the invasions seem overwhelming. This is not failure. This is being human. What matters is returning to the practice again and again with patience and commitment. We have traveled far together through these hours, exploring the architecture of the mind, the construction of that inner citadel that Marcus Aurelius knew to be the only true refuge. Now, as we move toward the close of our reflection, we do not arrive at an ending so much as a deepening, a settling into the understanding we have built. The citadel is not completed when our discussion concludes. It continues in the living application of these principles, in the daily practice that transforms philosophical concepts into lived wisdom. Think of how a stone fortress weathers over time. It does not remain pristine and unchanging. Rain wears at the mortar, wind carries dust into crevices, seasons leave their marks upon the walls. Yet the fortress endures, not because it remains untouched, but because its fundamental structure proves sound. The citadel of your mind will face similar weathering. Days will arrive that test your resolve. Circumstances will press against the walls you have built. This is not failure of your fortifications, but the natural condition of existence. The practice we have explored together equips you not to prevent such weathering, but to maintain your structure through it. Marcus wrote his meditations as reminders to himself, not as teachings for posterity. He knew that wisdom requires constant renewal. Even an emperor who had studied philosophy his entire life needed to return again and again to fundamental principles. This tells us something essential about the nature of the inner citadel. It is not built once and then left standing. It is rebuilt daily, reinforced through practice, maintained through attention. Each morning you wake to find that yesterday's philosophical clarity has dimmed slightly in sleep. This is not a problem to be solved, but a rhythm to be accepted. The practice is the point. Consider the watchman walking the walls at night, lantern in hand, checking each section of defense. His route never varies, yet each night's walk is necessary. He does not say, "I walked these walls yesterday, so tonight I need not bother." The watching itself is what maintains security. Similarly, your daily return to Stoic principles is not repetitive futility but essential maintenance. You examine your judgments, you distinguish between what lies within your control and what does not. You remind yourself of virtue's supremacy. These are not tasks to complete but practices to embody. The integration we seek is not intellectual mastery but lived understanding. You might grasp the dichotomy of control perfectly in theory, yet still find yourself disturbed by matters beyond your influence. This gap between understanding and embodiment is where the real work occurs. It is the space where philosophy becomes life rather than remaining mere concept. When you notice yourself troubled by something outside your control, and you pause and you remember, and you release that concern, returning your attention to your own choices and responses, you are not applying a technique. You are being a Stoic. The citadel is not a place you retreat to. It is what you become. Seneca spoke of the mind as a treasury where we store what matters most. Unlike material treasuries that can be robbed or destroyed, the mind's treasury is inviolable unless we ourselves betray it. No external circumstance can force you to abandon your principles. You might face imprisonment, exile, loss, illness, death itself, yet none of these can compel you to act against virtue if you do not consent. This is the ultimate security of the inner citadel. Its walls are not made of stone but of will, and will cannot be breached from without. Yet we must acknowledge the subtlety required here. The citadel is not maintained through rigidity but through responsive strength. A wall that cannot flex will crack under stress. A mind that clings too tightly to specific outcomes, even preferred ones, creates brittleness rather than resilience. The Stoic understanding of preferred indifference helps us here. We can prefer health to sickness, wealth to poverty, reputation to disgrace, while simultaneously holding these preferences lightly enough that their frustration does not compromise our inner peace. This is not indifference to outcomes, but freedom from enslavement to them. The fortress metaphor might suggest defensive isolation, a withdrawal from the world into protected interiority. This would be a misunderstanding of what Marcus intended. The inner citadel is not a place of retreat from engagement, but a secure foundation from which to engage. The general who knows his fortress is secure can venture forth without fear. The person who knows their inner peace cannot be taken from them without consent can participate fully in life's demands without being overwhelmed by them. Think of how differently you move through the world when you feel secure versus when you feel vulnerable. Vulnerability makes you defensive, reactive, quick to perceive threats. Security allows openness, responsiveness, generosity. The inner citadel provides this security. It does not make you invulnerable to life's hardships, but it makes you unbreachable in what matters most. Your character, your capacity for virtue, your essential self, these remain within your governance regardless of external circumstances. This distinction between harm and misfortune becomes clearer with practice. Misfortunes are external events that affect your circumstances. Losing a job, falling ill, being betrayed by someone you trusted. These are misfortunes. They are real, they have consequences, they warrant appropriate response. But harm, in the Stoic sense, is damage to your character, corruption of your judgment, betrayal of virtue. Misfortunes cannot force harm upon you. Only your own choices can truly harm you. The citadel protects not against misfortune but against harm. When Marcus reminded himself that the mind that has freed itself from passions is a citadel, he was not describing emotional numbness. The passions in Stoic thought are not emotions but rather excessive emotional responses driven by false judgments. You can feel grief without being destroyed by it, anger without being controlled by it, fear without being paralyzed by it, joy without being dependent on it. The citadel provides space for appropriate emotional response while preventing emotional tyranny. Consider how you have felt during difficult periods of your life. Perhaps there were moments when, despite challenging circumstances, you felt a certain steadiness, a capacity to respond rather than merely react. These moments offered glimpses of the citadel's security. They showed you that inner peace and outer difficulty can coexist. The practice we have explored together aims to make those moments not rare exceptions but your consistent experience. This does not happen through achievement but through release, through letting go of the judgments and attachments that compromise your peace. The architectural metaphor has served us well throughout this exploration, but we should recognize its limitations. A physical fortress is static, complete, separate from its builder. The inner citadel is none of these. It is dynamic, continually constructed, inseparable from who you are. You do not retreat into it because you are it. The security it offers is not separation but integration. When your judgments align with nature, when your will accepts what is while directing what you control, when your character expresses virtue regardless of circumstances, the distinction between fortress and self dissolves. This integration is what the Stoics meant by living according to nature. Not nature as the physical world, though that is included, but nature as the fundamental order of things, the logos that organizes existence. Your nature as a rational social being. Your capacity for virtue, for wisdom, justice, courage, moderation. When you live according to this nature, you are not constrained by rules but freed to be what you truly are. The citadel is not a cage but a space of freedom. Epictetus taught his students that freedom comes not from getting what you want but from ceasing to want what you cannot control. This sounds like resignation until you understand what it actually means. You still have preferences, still pursue goals, still care about outcomes. But you hold these lightly enough that their frustration does not disturb your fundamental peace. You do what you can, influence what you can influence, and accept what follows without betraying your principles. This is not passive but actively engaged while remaining inwardly free. As we have explored throughout these hours, building the inner citadel is not a project with a completion date but a practice that continues throughout life. There is no graduation from the need for vigilance, no achievement that places you beyond the requirement for daily attention. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men who ever lived, still needed to remind himself each morning of basic philosophical principles. If an emperor and philosopher required such daily practice, we can hardly expect to transcend that need. This might seem discouraging at first. You might wish for a state of permanent achievement, a point at which the work is done and you can simply rest in accomplished wisdom. But consider what that would actually mean. If you achieved permanent, unchanging inner peace, you would no longer be a living, responsive human being. You would be something static, complete, finished. Life is movement, change, encounter with the new. The practice of maintaining your citadel is what keeps you engaged with life rather than withdrawn from it. Think of the practice not as repetitive maintenance of the same thing but as daily renewal. Each morning brings a slightly different version of yourself, shaped by yesterday's experiences, facing today's unique circumstances. The principles remain constant, but their application is always fresh, always responsive to the present moment. When you examine your judgments today, you are not mechanically repeating yesterday's examination. You are meeting today's specific thoughts and responses with philosophical awareness. The integration we are exploring in this final segment is not synthesis of disparate elements but recognition of underlying unity. The various practices and concepts we have discussed, distinguishing between what you control and what you do not, examining your judgments, practicing voluntary discomfort, meditating on mortality, maintaining perspective on your place in the larger whole, these are not separate techniques but different aspects of a unified way of being. They all serve the same fundamental purpose: maintaining the inner citadel against the only threat that can truly compromise it, your own mistaken judgments. Consider how various threats to your peace all operate through the same mechanism. Someone insults you and you feel angry. You have suffered a misfortune and you feel despair. You anticipate future problems and you feel anxiety. Different circumstances, different emotions, but the same underlying process. In each case, you have added a judgment to the bare fact of what occurred. The insult is just words. The misfortune is just a circumstance. The future is unknown. Your judgment about these things is what disturbs your peace. The citadel's walls are built from the recognition that you can examine and modify these judgments. This is not self-deception or denial of reality. When something unfortunate happens, you do not pretend it is fortunate. You acknowledge what has occurred accurately, without the additions that create disturbance. Someone has insulted you. This is a fact. What does it require of you? You have suffered a financial loss. This is a circumstance. How should you respond? You face an uncertain future. This is the human condition. What lies within your control right now? These clear-eyed questions maintain the citadel's security not through fantasy but through precise relationship with what is. The Stoic practice is sometimes misunderstood as demanding constant self-surveillance, an exhausting hypervigilance about every thought and reaction. This would create a different kind of prison rather than a fortress of freedom. The practice, properly understood, gradually becomes more natural, less effortful. As you strengthen your ability to distinguish between what you control and what you do not, As you practice examining your judgments rather than immediately believing them, as you cultivate appropriate perspective on life's events, these become habitual ways of encountering experience. Think of learning any complex skill. At first, you must consciously attend to every element, and the effort is tiring. With practice, many aspects become automatic, and you can attend to subtler dimensions. Eventually, skilled performance becomes your natural way of operating. Philosophical practice follows a similar pattern. The conscious effort required initially gradually transforms into a more natural philosophical orientation. You find yourself spontaneously recognizing the difference between circumstances and judgments about circumstances, naturally pausing before reacting to consider what virtue requires. The inner citadel is both refuge and vantage point. From its walls, you see more clearly. The events that might overwhelm you when you are caught up in them appear different from the perspective it provides. Not smaller or less real, but contextualized, placed within a larger understanding. You can distinguish between what truly matters and what merely seems urgent in the moment. You can respond to circumstances from choice rather than from compulsion. This clarity is one of the Citadel's primary benefits. When your mind is turbulent, when emotions run high, when circumstances press hard, clear thinking becomes difficult. The security of your inner fortress provides the stability needed for wisdom. You are not untouched by difficulty, but not overwhelmed by it either. You maintain enough steadiness to think clearly, to consider what virtue requires, to choose your response rather than simply reacting from emotion or habit. Marcus often reminded himself that he had the power to have no opinion, to withhold judgment when judgment was not required. This is another form of the Citadel's security. You need not have an immediate evaluation of every event, an instant emotional response to every stimulus, a firm opinion on every matter. You can pause, consider, allow situations to unfold before deciding what they mean and what they require. This pause is not hesitation but wisdom. It is the space in which freedom operates. Consider how much of your disturbance comes from premature judgment, from deciding immediately that something is terrible or wonderful before you truly understand its nature or consequences. Events that seem catastrophic prove manageable or even beneficial with time. Outcomes that appear ideal create unforeseen complications. The Citadel's walls provide space to let things reveal themselves before committing to judgments about them. This does not mean paralysis or indecision about matters within your control, but rather appropriate patience about matters beyond it. The Stoics understood that we are all part of a larger whole, that our individual lives occur within vast networks of causation extending far beyond our comprehension. What seems random or purposeless from our limited perspective might serve purposes we cannot perceive. This is not an argument for passive acceptance of injustice or wrong. Matters within our control still demand our virtuous action, but it does suggest humility about our judgments of cosmic purpose. The Citadel includes this humility, this recognition of the limits of your perspective even as you maintain the security of your principles. As we near the close of our time together, it is worth reflecting on what changes and what remains constant in the practice of philosophy. Circumstances change continuously. You face new challenges, different opportunities, altered relationships. Your external life never stands still. Even your internal landscape shifts. Your emotions, thoughts, preoccupations all flow and change. But something in you can remain constant amidst all this change. Not a static, unchanging element, but a steady orientation, a committed alignment with virtue regardless of circumstances. This constancy is the Citadel's foundation. Not rigidity but reliability. Not inflexibility but integrity. You can trust yourself to respond virtuously because you have built that capacity through practice. You have strengthened your ability to distinguish between impressions and judgments, to recognize what lies within your control, to choose responses aligned with wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. These capabilities do not make you perfect, but they do make you reliable to yourself. You know that whatever comes, you have the resources to respond with virtue. The practice of philosophy is not separate from life but woven through it. You do not practice Stoicism for an hour each morning and then set it aside for the rest of the day. The principles inform every choice, every response, every moment. This is not exhausting because the principles simplify rather than complicate. Instead of being pulled in multiple directions by various desires and fears, you have a clear orientation. What does virtue require? What lies within my control? What judgments am I adding to the bare facts? These questions clarify rather than confuse. As these hours of reflection draw toward their close, we return to the essential insight with which we began. The inner citadel is not something foreign to you that must be constructed from external materials. It is built from your own capacity for reason, your own potential for virtue, your own fundamental nature as a being capable of wisdom. Everything required for its construction lies within you already. The practice simply reveals and strengthens what is already present. This is why the citadel cannot be taken from you. It is not a possession you might lose, but an expression of what you are. Circumstances might strip away everything external, every comfort, every relationship, every achievement, every possession, and the citadel remains because it is built from something circumstances cannot touch. Your capacity for virtue, your ability to choose your judgments, your fundamental selfhood, these persist as long as you do. The practice of Stoic philosophy is simply learning to live from this center, to identify with what is truly yours rather than with what fortune has temporarily granted you. Marcus wrote that nowhere can we find a more peaceful and trouble-free retreat than in our own mind. This is the invitation the inner citadel offers, not retreat from the world but retreat to yourself, to the place within you that remains secure regardless of external chaos. From this center, you engage with life more fully, more generously, more courageously, because you are not constantly defending against threats to a peace that depends on circumstances. Your peace is founded on something deeper, something reliable, something truly yours. The practice continues beyond this reflection. Tomorrow morning, you will wake to new circumstances, new challenges, new opportunities for virtue. The principles we have explored together remain available to you, not as abstract theories but as practical tools for living. When you notice disturbance arising, you can examine what judgment you are adding to circumstances. When you feel pulled into worry about matters beyond your control, you can return your attention to what lies within it. When you face difficulty, you can ask what virtue requires of you in this situation. These are not complicated interventions but simple redirections, returns to your center, to your citadel. Remember that the practice is meant to serve life, not replace it. You are not trying to become invulnerable or unfeeling, but to become free. Free to feel what is appropriate without being controlled by emotion. Free to pursue what matters without being enslaved by attachment. Free to engage fully while maintaining your center. The citadel provides this freedom. It is not a prison of self-control, but a foundation for authentic living. The integration we have explored throughout this final segment is not something you achieve once, but something you practice continuously. Each day offers new opportunities to live from your center, to respond from your citadel rather than reacting from circumstance. Some days you will do this well, maintaining your philosophical orientation through difficulty. Other days you will lose your center, find yourself disturbed by matters beyond your control, add unnecessary judgments to circumstances. This is natural, expected, part of the practice. The point is not perfection but direction, not achieving some final state but continuing the practice of return. As you continue beyond this reflection, carry with you the understanding that you are never without resources. The inner citadel is always available. In moments of difficulty, in periods of chaos, in times of uncertainty, you can return to what is truly yours. Your capacity for virtue, your ability to choose your response, your fundamental orientation toward wisdom. These remain constant, reliable, secure. Everything else might be stripped away, but this core remains. And from this core, you can meet whatever comes with steadiness, with courage, with appropriate response. The ancient Stoics practiced philosophy not as academic exercise, but as preparation for living well. They knew that life would bring challenges, losses, disappointments, sorrows. They knew that circumstances would often frustrate their preferences. They knew that fortune is fickle, that external goods are fragile, that nothing in the realm of circumstance is permanently secure. And knowing all this, they found freedom not through controlling circumstances but through building the inner citadel, through cultivating virtue, through aligning their will with nature. This same freedom remains available to you, built from the same materials through the same practice. The citadel stands, not as monument to what you have achieved, but as living practice of what you continue to become. Each return to principle strengthens its walls. Each choice for virtue deepens its foundation. Each moment of clarity extends its reach. The practice continues as it continued for Marcus, as it continued for Epictetus, as it has continued for everyone who has undertaken this path. You join a long tradition, not of perfect sages but of sincere practitioners, people who recognized what truly matters and oriented their lives accordingly. Rest now in the understanding that the work continues in its own time, that the citadel you have explored is always available, that the peace you seek is not distant but present whenever you turn your attention to what is truly yours. The principles remain, the practice continues, the path extends forward. And through it all, the inner citadel stands, secure, reliable, yours.